Social Darwinism produced two fundamental strains. One saw the world as a jungle in which individuals had to compete with one another for survival. The other, exemplified by the eugenicist and statistician Karl Pearson, argued that it was the group that constituted the Darwinian entity. Thus, it was the group that would define progress and dominance. It was this latter perspective that reinforced a set of ideas that arose, like Darwinism itself, from the Enlightenment and science. These were socialism and utopianism, both of which posited that the world was not a jungle, but a cooperative, in which the values of the community were privileged over those of the individual. Socialism arose in Europe in the 19th century to challenge some of the basic concepts of European civilization, such as the sanctity of private property and the principle of freedom as an individual rather than a collective ideal. Socialism, both in its utopian and Marxist forms, arose from two main sources: the Enlightenment of the 18th century, including the French Revolution, and the social, economic, and political and cultural changes that marked the Industrial Revolution. The Enlightenment philosophe Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the author of The Social Contract of 1762, whom we've met in a previous lecture, in particular attacked John Locke's claim that the ownership of private property was a natural right of mankind. To Rousseau, much of the misery in society was the result of the pursuit of property, and all unjust legal codes, restrictive moralities, and other ineffective elements in social organization came from the desire of those who held property to maintain and increase that property at the expense of those who did not. In the state of nature, Rousseau argued, there was no private property. Hence, it cannot be called a natural, inalienable right, as Locke had described it. Instead, it was actually a perversion of natural law, and our alienation from our happiness was exacerbated by the existence of private property. Carried to its logical conclusion, as Rousseau's disciples did in the French Revolution, laws that were in opposition to natural law and against the general will were invalid and oppressive. Consequently, they should be disobeyed and rescinded by force if necessary. But although the revolution was begun by middle-class owners of property, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen specifically upheld the right to private property, many revolutionaries saw property as the symbol and the instrument of inequality. As we saw, the call for liberty, fraternity, and equality motivated some peasants to attack their landlords during the Great Fear in the late summer of 1789, and the revolution itself expropriated church lands to issue the assignats, thus compromising the principle of private property. Even after the end of the Terror, there were still those who remained disciples of radicalism. Radicalism represented the complete restructuring in society from the roots up. Radix in Latin means roots. These men believed that society needed to be radically reorganized and wanted to continue Robespierre's experiments and impose equality and virtue. Amongst these men, radicalized by the revolution and angered by the conservative reaction, was François Gracchus Babeuf. Babeuf had read Rousseau and read the classics, despite his lack of formal education. He came from an extremely poor background. And Babeuf became a devotee of Rousseau's claim that in the state of nature, all men are equal. Inspired, Babeuf set out then to write a work that advocated this view. In a burst of naive optimism, he proposed that the government should divide all the arable land in France equally amongst all of France's families, which would give each family approximately 14 acres. This very strange book, called Le Cadastre Perpétuel, was printed before 1789. But Babeuf's ideas were unsurprisingly not accepted by the National Assembly, as it did not desire social leveling and the abolition of the rights to private property. During the Terror, Babeuf was closely associated with the Jacobins, acting, in fact, as an administrator of food in Paris. He seems, though, to have had a curious attitude towards other people's property as well, because he was imprisoned for fraud in that job. He became a journalist shortly after the end of the Terror and editor of the People's Tribune, and then he began styling himself as Gracchus, after the Roman brothers, who in the 2nd century BC had been known for their fair distribution of land while serving as tribunes of the people. The publication of Babeuf's ideas on equality led some lower middle class and some Parisian workers to support his call for a redistribution of wealth. This group became known as the Conspiracy of Equals, after Babeuf's manifesto, the Manifesto of Equals. He wished to continue the revolution through the expropriation of all private property, the disallowance of any inheritance, and the creation of a dictatorship led by the workers of Paris. We can see with his last comment that, like Darwin, Marx did not appear in a vacuum. None of these thinkers did. They built upon those that went before. And even our friend Gracchus Babeuf made a contribution to later thought. But as the Conspiracy of Equals sought to build more and more support, they collided with the Directory. The Directory was tired of radicalism, wanted to establish a legitimate government. Consequently, the Directory arrested Babeuf and his followers, charged them with treason, and had them executed. Despite the efforts of the French monarchy after the Restoration in 1815 to suppress radicalism, it was difficult to contain, as the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 were to prove. The use of violence against the bourgeois government of France was also advocated by another Frenchman some 35 years after the execution of Babeuf. This was Louis-Auguste Blanqui. Blanqui, like Babeuf, called for the use of violence against the Bourbon regime, joining the French revolutionary underground. He participated in both the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, and he consequently discovered that the middle classes were not revolutionary, and when pressured, they would always side with the government against the working classes. The bourgeois revolution of 1830, he thought, had brought little benefit to the workers. So Blanqui asserted that only another revolution, this time led by the working class, could bring about the restructuring of society. Blanqui called for the creation of an egalitarian communist republic through force of arms. So he began forming revolutionary cells in order to oppose the French state, defining it as a conspiracy of industrialists that must be attacked with concentrated violence. Well, today we would call Blanqui a terrorist, a term that actually had its origins in 1795 with the Reign of Terror in France. He believed that the liberal middle classes would do very little to support the workers without being forced to participate through violence. And despite his violent message and actions, Blanqui actually led a very long life. True, much of it was spent in jail, but nevertheless, he lived, in fact, to a ripe old age. But he was rejected by later revolutionaries, particularly Karl Marx. And in fact, Marx used the term Blanquisme as a term of opprobrium for those revolutionaries who engaged in violence without an ideological motive. According to Marx, Blanqui and those who practiced Blanquisme were without scientific purpose. They had not, in fact, built an end into their violence, and so consequently it was simply an act of anger and extremely naive. However, not all socialists were committed to violence. There were those who believed that the working class could be liberated by the ballot box. Liberal political action could be applied, and trade union activity could also be used as the instruments through which social and industrial progress would occur. These radicals, who sought a fairer world for the future, were called utopian socialists because, of course, they were looking for utopia. They were looking for a utopia on earth. Again, showing how far the idea of Thomas More in his book could be carried. Utopia, a term created by More for his imaginary island. Well, chief amongst these utopian socialists were Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. All three of these men were troubled by the many problems accompanying unrestrained economic growth in capitalism, believing that the competition for profits left the poor behind and led to waste and cruelty. The utopians also hoped to avoid the economic crises that had accompanied the early Industrial Revolution, with its booms and busts and that put thousands out of work, as well as wiping out investment. Moreover, these men of education, influence, and often wealth, put forth a variety of plans and proposals that would benefit all of industrial society, so that every citizen could benefit from the huge increases in wealth and progress that obviously characterized the world in which they were living. Well, among the most influential and interesting of these utopian socialists was Count Henri de Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon was descended from the ancient nobility of France. In fact, a descendant of one of the Duc de Saint-Simon who wrote those marvelous memoirs of the court of Louis XIV. Saint-Simon, moreover, as a young aristocratic officer, had fought in the American War of Independence and was greatly impressed with the American work ethic. He wrote that there were no idle classes in America, and this became one of his models. During the French Revolution, though, he gave up his titles and privileges, and he also lost much of his fortune. But he also assumed the identity of a poor Parisian worker so that he could see society from both ends. He saw the privilege and wealth of the aristocracy into which he was born, and at the same time, he lived as a poor Parisian during the period of the Revolution to see how the poor actually lived. That didn't mean that he altogether decided to forget his privileges. His entire life, he was awakened each morning by his servant who rang a bell in his ear and said, "Arise, Monsieur le Comte, you have great things to do today." Saint-Simon called for the creation of a completely new society because he was deeply concerned about the injustices and class divisions being created by industrialization. He argued that the world did not need the non-productive classes of the clergy and the nobility. Rather, to ensure equality, he said that society should be directed by groups of enlightened middle-class experts, trained to understand and to shape society to the benefit of all. Influenced as he was by the Enlightenment, Saint-Simon referred to this group as the Council of Newton. And these experts would specialize in science, in public affairs, and in the arts. This intellectual elite would plan for maximizing productivity, maximizing political participation, so that all citizens would benefit by directing society to beneficial ends. All would be happy, everyone would live in harmony. Saint-Simon's ideas saw print in his The Reorganization of European Society, which was published in 1814. This book argued that reason and scientific progress could cure all of the ills of industrial society. It was still an age of optimism. Saint-Simon's ideas established the principle that economic production could be used to determine social and political goals, and that controlling the means of production could determine the wealth of a society and the manner in which it was distributed. Well, not unexpectedly, Saint-Simon had disciples, and interestingly, not among the poor, but from the educated middle class, especially scientists, and especially from the French scientific university, the École Polytechnique. They too believed that centralized planning and large state projects would direct and benefit the economy. And of course, they also believed that they would form the intellectual elite charged with this task. They all saw themselves as charter members of the Council of Newton. Saint-Simon's influence was extremely important, particularly, as we'll see, for Karl Marx, because he was one of the first thinkers to analyze historical change in terms of the struggle between social and economic classes. He also believed that the control of the means of production was the critical element in this economic progress, and that socialism would necessarily triumph because of rational man's desire for cooperation. A contemporary utopian socialist, but one who offered solutions very different from those of Saint-Simon, was the idealistic and charming Charles Fourier. Fourier believed that a new society could be brought about by rational cooperation among men and the rationalized structure of industrial production. Here, he was very much in sympathy with the arguments of Saint-Simon. But Fourier disagreed with the Count about granting power to an intellectual elite. Rather, Fourier argued, 2,000 years of history illustrated clearly that elites, intellectual or otherwise, had only brought the world war, greed, and poverty. Capitalism was just one more step along this road to misery, as it exploited the workers because of the competitive nature of the marketplace. Fourier was the son of a middle-class merchant, quite a successful one, and he himself was apprenticed in commerce, so he knew trade from the inside, and he hated it. Influenced by Newtonian physics, Fourier sought the causes of the social laws of the universe. He was looking for the laws, like Auguste Comte, that would ultimately determine how society would unfold according to principles that would direct it towards beneficial goals for everyone. Well, this developed into his celebrated theory of harmony, which described how social progress could lead to harmonization on a universal scale through the voluntary associations of small groups. At the heart of Fourier's socialism was one of the most curious inventions of the 19th century European mind, the phalanstery. It comes from the Greek word phalanx, which means formation. The phalanstery was to be a small community organized around exactly 1,620 individuals. Well, how did Fourier come to this exact number? He had concluded through study and observation that there were 810 different characteristics or personality traits among people. And to reflect these various traits and to balance men and women equally, he doubled 810 to arrive at the ideal community size of 1,620 individuals. These 1620 would be responsible for all of the jobs within the community, with everyone doing the work for which each was best suited. One of the most charming observations, he said that the children had to have a role, but not working in factories or mines, but they would be the garbage collectors, because children like jobs where they could get dirty and tip over a waste paper basket and there's a child there instantly. So the perfect job for children would be garbage collection. Each individual would have the greatest opportunity, moreover, for self-expression and self-fulfillment, which would make Fourier's communities free from any kind of strife, he believed. Not only would people be happy in their work, but also these communities would be free of bureaucracy and competition because they would essentially run the operations themselves. They would be self-regulating, and they would decide when they were bored, when they were unhappy, when they were doing something for which they were not suited, and they would simply make arrangements to switch around. And if bored with his or her work, any member of the community would have the right to seek fulfillment by changing jobs. Also, Fourier supported equality between the sexes. And in fact, this was something that characterized a number of the utopian socialists, and that is the liberation of women and sexual liberation. Because Fourier believed that giving equality to the sexes would in fact result in a fundamental sexual revolution in the phalanstery. He wrote that he welcomed conventional families of mother, father, and children. But he also, he didn't say encouraged, but he also welcomed what he referred to as polyamorous unions. These were to be permitted because he believed that this was another element of fulfillment and of personal exploration in order to understand how human beings best related to one another. And also it was closely associated with the idea of people as property, that your wife is your property, your husband is your property, and as soon as you went beyond the idea of personal property, then you shared all things in common, from each according to his or her ability, to each according to his or her need. In fact, he wrote that he imagined that the phalanstery would develop, quote, a host of amorous innovations we cannot yet imagine. Well, Fourier did believe that the social system should be allowed to gratify all desires, including sexual desires. Moreover, he saw that this had to be done without violence or revolution or hierarchy, all of which Fourier abhorred. His desire then was complete and total harmony. He also had an insight into human nature. He realized that some jobs in the phalanstery are harder than others. Some require a great deal of training, some require very little. Some are purely mechanical, some require a lot of labor. So he said there had to be some recognition of this. So he permitted a pay scale that paid the more difficult jobs a higher rate. However, because this would breed inequality, there would be a graduated income tax system that reduced everybody at the end of the year to exactly the same amount of money. So you had the pleasure of knowing you were earning more, but you didn't get to keep it. You had the recognition that the community would see in a higher salary, but it wouldn't benefit you in any way whatsoever. Fourier believed that if this system should be implemented and put in place, then it would exist for exactly 8,000 years. You can see in Fourier the love of numbers and statistics. This is, after all, the period of Kant and positivism. The two of them were contemporaries and writing in the same country. What is also extremely interesting is that Fourier had a number of disciples who actually tried to introduce these principles. In fact, his ideas had some traction, and the 1848 revolution in Paris actually debated instituting a phalanstery. But of course it came to nothing. And Fourier himself died in poverty, still waiting to see his universal harmony come to pass. But he has to be looked at in a broader perspective, because what Charles Fourier really was the cultural ancestor of the 1960s Commune. And it's not an accident then that his greatest following was in the United States. In the 19th century, Fourier communities were formed in Utopia, Ohio, and, of all places, Texas. They did not do terribly well, but nevertheless, the very fact that they were tried. And when we look at the model of the 1960s Commune in all of its forms, we see, in fact, essentially the ideas of Fourier, except for the fact that they were not mandated to contain exactly 1,620 people. The last of our great utopian socialist thinkers was, to some extent, a hero of many movements. He was the hero of the trade union movement. He was the hero of the socialists. He was a hero in many instances of politicians and even of the Anglican Church. An idealistic cotton mill owner who used his own vast wealth to benefit his workers. And this is Robert Owen. Owen became one of Britain's leading social reformers, trying to use his profits, and they were immense, to benefit the workers and to establish a community that centered on the factory. He was an extremely intelligent man. He also was an active capitalist. And so he saw the problem perhaps becoming as its own solution. The factory was the cause of misery, and so perhaps it could be the instrument used to address the evils of 19th century industrialism. Don't try and escape the factory, but actually use it as a benefit for the workers who toiled within it. He used his own wealth in order to purchase 4 mills in New Lanark, Scotland, where he began to build a model community. Unlike Saint-Simon and Fourier, Owen initially had strong government support. Many people spoke in his favor, including leading politicians. Even the Church of England strongly supported him in the person of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop of Canterbury blessed New Lanark and saw this as a solution, perhaps, to the embarrassment and the discomfort that the solid middle classes had about the conditions of the poor in the early 19th century. Owen believed that the structure of the community could shape the individuals who lived within it. Now, this, of course, is found in Fourier's phalanstery as well, but it also is true to any structure of social engineering. We've seen it in Moore's Utopia. We've seen it in Montesquieu's belief that the law can shape the nature of a community. And we're going to see it in almost all of the socialist confessions, that you create a society in such a way that the people who live in that society will actually be changed and then live according to certain principles that are better than the individual principles that they would develop if they were competing with one another and where there was a hierarchy and some benefited and some lost. Soon after establishing his mills at New Lanark, Robert Owen began to experiment with his desire to improve the lot of those who worked in his factories. He added a school for the workers' children, and also he insisted that the 500 children who were employed in the factory would have to go to school as well. He believed that education was the instrument by which the lot of the poor would be improved. Just because he believed in education in itself? Well, no. He believed that education was a vehicle to inculcate middle-class values, that is, values of responsibility and self-reliance, and also self-respect and confidence. So education to him was a means to an end. It was something that he required the children in the factories to do, but it's also something that he provided for them with no cost. In order to do this, he had to change the working hours. He reduced the hours of the working day from 11 3/4 to 10 3/4. And the expectation was, of course, that the additional time would be used for self-improvement. Moreover, he set up a company store, but a company store that didn't, unlike all of the other company stores in the factory towns, did not profit from the workers. What Owen paid, they paid. Moreover, again influenced by ideas developed by thinkers like Fourier, he rotated the jobs to help overcome boredom. He saw that one of the elements, and again Marx would build on this, of the alienation of the worker from his labor, he believed that part of the boredom and the alienation of the factory class was driven by the fact that they did mind-numbing work, day after day, 10 or 12 hours every single day, 6 days a week. So if you changed the jobs, if you gave them new tasks, they would not only develop new skills, but they would be less bored. He also fined girls for illegitimate births, hoping to reduce that perpetual problem within the factory system. And again, here he is hardly enlightened by punishing those who felt the effect of promiscuity rather than those who were actually the co-conspirators, that is, the boys in the factory. But nevertheless, he saw this as a way to try and reduce the problem of illegitimacy amongst the factory classes. He also set aside wages for old age, sickness, and disability. In other words, he ran a kind of social assistance fund by taking or keeping some of the wages from his workers, adding slightly to these, and ensuring that if they got sick, they wouldn't starve. If they were injured in the factory, they would not starve, and their families would not starve. So there was very much a sense then that it was a community that had levels of mutual responsibility. And Owen felt that he had the most, but also it was Owen who was calling the shots. These reforms at New Lanark were designed so that they would be a model for others. He truly believed that by showing that this system would work, that the workers would be better, happier, more disciplined, that in fact profits would actually rise. That didn't happen. He advocated an expansion of his system with the establishment of individual self-sufficient industrial townships all across England. He had hoped that other industrialists would follow his lead. In fact, that the Tory government would begin addressing the problems caused by industrialization as a consequence by assisting in the creation of these industrial townships. Well, as I say, it didn't happen. Owen's own partners had to be bought out because they argued that they were losing too much profit because of his social experiments. Other industrialists saw him, in fact, as a disease, as a danger to their profits, and a spokesman for the most dangerous elements of radicalism. He also realized that many of the workers didn't live up to his expectations of them, that they didn't become more disciplined and happier, and they didn't go to work with smiles on their faces and singing "Off to Work We Go," but rather, in fact, saw it as another job and took advantage of Owen the way they would any other advantage that was offered to them. Well, despite his tireless efforts to publicize the reforms at New Lanark then, there were very few in government and virtually none in industry eager to see his reforms succeed, let alone be adopted. Eventually, various economic and social forces tore the New Lanark community apart, and Owen, by then, had become so disillusioned that he decided to sell his factories in 1827 and even leave the continent. He believed that Europe was beyond salvation and he would look to the New World, a place where there was still a clean slate, where his ideas could be applied without any of the burden and baggage of the old world. So he moved to the United States, and he tried there a new experiment with the construction of New Harmony in Indiana. But this project too was a bitter failure. In fact, it never really got off the ground because of the clash between collective and individual interests, and the fact that Owen did believe that he was more equal than everybody else. Marx later argued that the utopians had failed to understand the true forces that shape economic, social, and political relationships. He characterized the utopians as naive dreamers and argued that his was the only solution to the inequalities created by capitalism. Only the creation of a revolutionary proletariat, Marxist terminology for the working class, would be able to seize the means of production through violent revolution and create a communist society. And only this would change the current situation. And with this doctrine of revolution and violence, the social and economic tensions within Europe grew ever more dangerous, driving all sides into hardened positions, where those with property feared once more those without, and those without were told that the only way that they could become part of the system was through violence. These hardened positions would preclude any hope for the harmony sought by the utopians. It was fortunately only through the ballot box and the creation of socialist parties that worked within the democratic system that this dangerous tension was to a degree diffused. Nevertheless, it was a diffusion that the Marxist socialists refused to recognize, and they still called for violent revolution, as we shall see in the next lecture.